that at one point there was that breath of air. Okay? The only difference is this isn't the original spelling. All those WHs all those WHs were originally HWs. They began with what, while for whale, okay, whoa for who, okay. The change from HW to WH happens as a result and during, we'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks, during the Middle English period. Why? French comes over. French becomes the dominant language. What do no French words begin with? None. That's why we have hors d'oeuvres, not hors d'oeuvres. Okay? You don't pronounce this, H-E-U-E-R, hewer, it's ur. Okay? So, all those H's drop off. Here, it's a fossil. Unless you pronounce the, and some people do, the slightly. Some people actually make a difference between this and this. For me, they're exactly the same. Whale, whale. Okay? Or even that. Okay? Two of the four main groups of linguistic typologies, isolating, incorporative, agglutinative, inflectional, okay, are the four. These came essentially right from the notes. How many cases in Proto-Indo-European? 8. The 7 features that distinguish Germanic from the other Indo-European languages. Vocabulary, that is a common distinctive vocabulary. I'm trying to figure out what page they are in these notes. Oh, I don't have the notes numbered. They're towards the end under the Germanic languages. Shared common distinctive vocabulary. 2 tense verb system. Okay. What else? Weak verbs with dental suffix. That's one of the distinctive things. It's not 2 tense verb system with dental suffix, because that doesn't make any sense. Okay? So, weak verbs with a dental suffix for the past tense or preterite tense. What else? Weak and strong adjectives. You didn't have to tell me how you tell the difference between the two. Just weak and strong adjectives. Okay? First syllable stress. Vowel shift from Indo-European to Germanic. Right? Or just the vowel. If you just put down vowel shift, I accepted that. And then lastly, first sound shift or Grimm's law. You didn't have to explain it. Just, that's one of the 7 characteristics. Okay? Top of the next page. That's both of those. Let me throw this up there, since it's a lot easier to show it than to put it down. So, E, A, E, O, O, U, back over here. Sound is voiced. There's a rubbing in the vocal cords. Okay? The 39, the linguist, Grimm. 40, air completely stops somewhere in the vocal or oral cavity, if you want, before being released. It doesn't only stop at the front of the mouth. Give me 2 examples where it doesn't stop in the front of the mouth. And G. G is smooth or unvoiced. G is voiced or also called rough. Okay? Difference between a vowel and a consonant. With a vowel, a couple of you, you memorized the definition in the book. That was great. I don't have it written down, so I'm not going to go over that. With a vowel, the air is not impeded. With a consonant, air is impeded by lips, teeth, throat, tongue, okay? Possibly nasal cavity, because it gets thrown up through there. Sorry, I shouldn't use the phrase thrown up after having the flu. It gets pushed up through there. Grimm's Law. Step 1. The first blank, Indo-European aspirated voice stops, become Proto-Germanic unaspirated voice stops. It's the only difference, okay? And no H, no H, no H, okay? Step 2. Except when preceded by S, Indo-European voiceless stops become Proto-Germanic voiceless fricatives. So becomes Pisces becomes fish. Man, brain is just absolutely dead. I can't think of the one that goes to 3. Trey becomes 3, okay, and cat becomes hat, okay. Step 3, Indo-European voiced stops, but become Proto-Germanic voiceless stops. B becomes p, d becomes t, g becomes k, okay. Number 50, it's false. Embryonic is the very beginning. Embryonic is what we really, we've got all kinds of symbols that date from, 8,000 BC, going back to as far as about 42 to 50,000 BC. That's considered embryonic writing. It's embryonic because it's not fully developed and we don't know what any of it means. Right? Pictographic we can figure out because pictures what? They resemble things. Picture tells 1,000 words, so to speak. Okay? True writing first developed in Europe? Nope. It's false. Hieroglyphics are an example of pictorial writing? Nope. They're what? They're analytic. They're between. There are some pictures. There are some ideographs. Okay? Champollion was primarily responsible. That's true. Okay? Young was the one who made some of the initial clues, some of the initial discoveries. But it was Champollion who took Young's work and really applied it to, for example, the Rosetta Stone and cracked the Rosetta Stone. He couldn't have done it without him, but he was the one who was primarily responsible for it. Let me put this up here. So the Germanic tree, number 1, North, number 2, West, number 3, English, 4, Gothic, 5, High, 6, Low, 7, Old Norse, 8, West Norse, 9, Icelandic, and then 10 way down over here underneath Old Saxon, modern Low German. 64, cuneiform is an example of ideographic writing. That's true. That is, it can express ideas. In fact, the earliest cuneiform is not expressing abstract ideas like love and beauty and truth and justice and all that kind of stuff. It's economic. It's a bill of sale. The earliest form of writing is not to express poetic ideas. It's economic transactions. Kind of, for those of us who love writing and how it means so many things, it's kind of, deflating. The economists love that. 65, alphabets are the first true phonetic writing system. False. What are? Syllabaries. Syllabaries. Okay? Why? They represent sound. totally represent sound. Syllabaries do. Only consonants true, okay? But they still represent sound. 67, yes, cuneiform is made by impressing a stylus into wet clay. 68, the Greek alphabet was not borrowed from the Etruscans. Who'd they get it from? Another question later on. The Phoenicians. 69, the letter A in the Greek, Latin, Phoenician, cuneiform writing systems is ultimately based on the ideograph for the word ox. That is, it represents the idea, ox, and it looks like it. Okay? And then number 7, Sir William Jones. Sir William Jones. Okay? Extra credit. Yes?
66.
Did I skip 66? 66, Rosetta Stone. Extra credit. The first blank, Kurgan, Kurgan. Some of you thought that was a coffee maker, but Keurig. It's kind of close enough. The second part of it, Indo-European. If you put Proto-Indo-European, that was fine too. Number 3, Anatolian. Number 4, Armenian. Number 5, morpheme. Number 6, phoneme. Number 7, very interesting spellings. It's like half of you are dyslexic, I think. Because you had etonym. E-T-O-N-Y-M. Rather than E-T-Y-M-O-N. Etymon. Okay? Etymology is the study of the history of words, going back to their earliest forms. Number 8, it is not Shakespeare, it is Caxton. I think one person had William Shakespeare. Number 9, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. If you've never seen a Gutenberg Bible, go to the National Archive. I think it's the National Archives in D.C. It's either the National Archives. Yeah, it's the National Archives. And see one of the surviving Gutenberg Bibles. Number 12, Phoenician, again, P-H-O-E-N-I-C-I-A-N. 13, doesn't matter which order you put these in, Satem, S-A-T-E-M, and Kentum, K-E-N, C-E-N-T-U-M. Notice, by the way, that pronunciation. Hard C, right? There's a basketball team in Boston. What are they called?
The Celtics.
The Celtics. It's wrong. Because you don't talk about the Celts. You talk about the Celts. Okay? Number 15. The two important words there are known, attested. Gothic. Proto-Germanic, it's unattested. It's all when you have a proto-language, that means before. Okay? That's always attested, or excuse me, that's always assumed and prefixed if there are words with an asterisk. That means we don't have any actual examples of this still surviving. We got tons of Gothic. Most of the New Testament, for example, survives in Gothic. Whole bunch of names also, by the way. Okay? Oldest form of the English language, and I give you two possibilities there, Anglo-Saxon or Old English. Now, the second part kind of screws people up because people think Shakespeare. That's Old English because he talks about why doths and haths and etc. That's not Old English, okay, as we will see. 18, linguistics is the study of human speech and language. The earliest attested Indo-European language. Now, Sir William Jones thought that was Sanskrit. But about 135 years, about 1920 or so, 1922, after Jones, A library was discovered in modern-day Turkey, and that library contained cuneiform texts in Hittite. Prior to that discovery, everybody thought the Hittites of the Old Testament were mythological. They weren't real. Once that was discovered, it was like, okay, so they're real. They're actually real people. Okay? And then number 20, Jacob Grimm. And that is the same Jacob Grimm who, along with his brother, walked around collecting fairy tales and published them as Grimm's fairy tales. Okay? Now, since it's almost like we are starting the class for the first time this semester, I have no idea where we left off. I think Christianization, okay. And I brought in a bunch of, as I think I referred to it the other day, show and tell kind of stuff. Let me back up real briefly, for just a few seconds. Talking about this, the Germanic migration, so to speak, or the invasions, which is the word I like to use because I like fighting. These didn't happen, overnight. That is, the Germanic tribes didn't come in and subdue the Romano-Celtic population of Britain quickly. This took a long time, several generations. We have written accounts, largely through Bede, but a couple of others also, that are talking about the wars between Germanic chieftains and Romano-Celtic chieftains all the way up into the late 6th century, late 500s. That is, about the same time that Augustine, arrives over here, they're still fighting over here and pushing in this area and this area. The Germanic tribes are still conquering, in other words. Okay? So, Christianization. Let's see. Do I have anything in here? No, let's go on a little bit. So, it takes about 150 years down there at the bottom. Is that focused? Or is that just my eyes? Let's zoom in a little bit. It takes about 150 years for the Christianization. Now, Augustine comes in around 597, so what does that mean? Roughly by 750, okay, those Germanic-speaking peoples are, I think it's fair to say, conservatively, at the very least, nominally Christian. That is, yeah, they've heard the stories, and they kind of accept maybe that it's true, okay? We know there are some who are really serious. They really accept it. They burn their pagan shrines, etc. They accept Christianity lock, stock, and barrel. Okay? Now, one of the ways that happens, and one of the ways the Christianization occurs, is that when Augustine arrives, he kind of gets the lay of the land, so to speak, and his missionaries that he sends out kind of after him. And one of the problems they confront is that there are already a lot of quote-unquote holy sites, Holy sites, throughout England or England. Okay? These are pagan holy sites. Wells, streams, rivers, mountaintops. Okay? So, Augustine runs into that problem. There's already all these pagan shrines, so to speak. What do we do about them? He writes a letter to Gregory. Gregory writes a letter back. Bede quotes from these letters. Kind of. Syncretism is one word to use for it. The word Gregory uses for it is baptism. We will baptize those pagan sacred sites. And as a person is baptized and the quote-unquote old man is killed and the new man is put on, they're baptized into death and they rise into Christ. So these old pagan shrines are, as in the rite of baptism, the full early church kind of rite of baptism, they're exorcised first. So there are prayers said to exorcise the quote-unquote demons, and then the place is baptized, it's sprinkled with holy water, there are all kinds of prayers said, and now it becomes a holy place. Okay? So a spring that might have been a location to a quote-unquote spirit of darkness, or as the Old English puts it, the Gastbona, the slayer of souls, that now becomes a place dedicated to a saint. Okay? Maybe an early Christian who had been, sacrificed there to the slayer of souls, so to speak. Okay? So that's one of the ways this process goes on. So 597 to within 150 years, so 750, and I've got Caedmon's Hymn. Well, who's Caedmon? Those of you who are in my 3010 course, you've already heard some of this. Caedmon was a cowherd at a monastery, unlettered, illiterate, okay, who late in his life has a dream or a vision. I'll leave that to you to decide. And what Bede tells us of his story, and Bede is a contemporary of Caedmon. Now, no modern historian, almost no modern historian, believes Caedmon really lived. They'll all suggest Caedmon's a mythic story. Okay? Bede believed he existed because Bede says, I met him. I knew him personally, kind of a thing. Caedmon is sitting one night in the monastery refectory, the dining room, and the harp is coming around. The reason the harp is coming around is because people have been eating and drinking. Bede refers to what is happening in the dining room as Yebershipa. This is the word for beer. Beership. Like a party. They're monks. Okay? Go to Europe. You don't drink water. And you don't drink milk. You drink beer. Okay? So, they're drinking beer, they're drinking ale, and the harp is coming around. And when the harp comes around, I've had my turn, now it's W's turn, and then you go on, and everybody gets a turn. And Caedmon sees the harp coming to him, and he can't sing. I don't mean he can't sing like me, he can't carry a tune. He doesn't know the rules for Anglo-Saxon or Germanic alliterative meter. He doesn't know how to create a song. Okay? So he gets up and leaves. He goes off to the cowshed and he falls asleep. Why? He's probably had a little bit too much to drink. And in his sleep, he has a vision. A man comes to him and says, Caedmon, sing to me. And in his vision, in his dream, Caedmon replies, I don't know how to sing. And the man says, nevertheless, sing to me. Okay. That's kind of fancy language for, don't tell me you don't know how to sing. I told you to sing to me. And Caedmon says, what shall I sing, Lord? In other words, okay, what do you want me to sing to you about? And the person says, sing to me about the creation of all things. And this is what Caedmon sings. Now, this is the Old English. Caedmon spoke Old English. When Bede transcribes what Caedmon wrote, Bede puts it in Latin. Why? Because he's writing in Latin. And he tells his reader, this is the gist of what Caedmon sang, but it's not the original. I have translated it. And when you translate from one language to another, you necessarily lose the real meaning. But fortunately for us, somebody shortly after Bede wrote this all down in 731, Okay? Caedmon has the vision in 680. 680, 681. So Bede records all this in Latin, and very, very shortly after that, it gets retranslated back into Old English. And we have now about a half dozen, roughly from about 730 to 750, versions of Caedmon's hymn. They're pretty much the same. They're not identical. Why? Some of them are written in Northumbrian dialect, which is what Caedmon would have spoken. Some of them are written in the late West Saxon dialect, down southern England. Some of them are written in more of an East Anglian dialect. Okay, so word choice, differs a little bit, but this is the general sense. Okay, now I just copied and pasted this from, I don't remember where, might have been Wikipedia. Most of the versions don't have this word in it. Okay, most of them just read Nu schulen herian haven reaches word. Merkt his makta on his modjathok. Werk woel der vader, swahi wundri was. Eetje drichten or unstelde. Hey, erst shop, erthen bernum. Heaven trova, heiligschippen. Tha middenjaard, munkinneswaard. Eetje drichten afterteade. Firm fuldan, freya almichtig. That's what Caedmon, prior to the vision, didn't know how to do. Why? Well, if you look at that poem, try and get where am I? Try and get most of it up there. What can you immediately notice? You can't notice it in every line, but you can notice it in many of them. What? Ma. Ha. Ma. F. Alliteration, right? Okay. This is native Germanic practice. Okay. And I could put up, and I'm not going to, I could put up on the board here about 7 rules that all Old Germanic alliterative poetry follows. Now, they're not rules in the sense that someone wrote a rule book. They're rules in the sense that early scholars of the Germanic languages, having read all the poetry that survives in these early Germanic languages, found these 7 consistencies all the way throughout. Okay? So notice, this is not E.E. Cummings. This is not easy to write. Okay? Because, as an example, you have alliteration. Well, what does that mean? Well, certain sounds alliterate with other certain sounds. But it's not just haphazard. The sounds that alliterate are stressed syllables. There are 4 stressed syllables in each line. So this altogether is a line. This is a half line, and this is a half line. You have 2 stressed syllables here, and 2 stressed syllables here. 3 of those stressed syllables may alliterate. The 4th stressed syllable never alliterates. And 1 stressed syllable in the first half line must alliterate with the first stressed syllable of the second half line. That's like 3 of the 7 rules. Not real easy, right? Imagine you're illiterate. You don't know how to read anyways. And you're supposed to remember all this? So, the vision comes to Caedmon. This is what he sings. He goes back to sleep the next morning. He goes back to the monastery. He says, like Bottom, I've had a wonderful dream. And he tells the priests the dream he had. And the priests, being good priests, being familiar with Scripture, they're going to test the spirits, as St. John says in his first letter. How are they going to test the spirits? Is this vision really from God? So Abbess Hild, the abbess over the monastery, former princess, gave up secular life, became an abbess at the age of 33. Okay? She says, okay, we're going to test this spirit. So here's what you're going to do, Caedmon. You're going to go off with a couple of these priests, and they're going to tell you some biblical stories. Tomorrow morning, you better come back and have converted those biblical stories into poetry, into song. And if you don't, then we know this isn't a spirit from God. But you can kind of, figure out the rest of the sentence, so to speak. And he's like, cool. So he goes off, according to Bede, and they tell him a bunch of stories. And the next morning, he comes back and he turns those stories into poetry. And Bede tells us what kind of stories he turned into poetry. Exodus. The departure of the Hebrews from Egypt. The crossing of the Red Sea. The tale of the 3 youths in the fiery furnace, also called Azarias. The book of Daniel, and several other things. Well, lo and behold, there is a manuscript in Oxford University Library, at the Bodleian Library, that has as its general name, or had as its general name, the Caedmon manuscript. Why? Because the poetry it contains includes everything that Bede said Caedmon composed. Nobody thinks those poems were composed by Caedmon. Why? Because the language in the poems is all much, much later than Caedmon's early Old English. This is real, real early. Okay? So why is this so important? It's the first time in the history of any European vernacular language. Vernacular. Everyday, ordinary, common speech. It's the first time in any European vernacular language that somebody has used that native vernacular language and poetic techniques for Christian purposes. That is, for didactic poetry. This isn't merely designed to please. It's designed to teach. Which, if you're familiar with the first century Roman poet, Horace, he said the purpose of literature is twofold: to teach and to delight. You guys have probably had courses where you've read poetry where it's pretty clear about the teaching part. The delighting part, the poet might not have cared very much for because it's really boring. It's really didactic. That is, it's beating you over the head. Similarly, you might have had poetry, courses in poetry, where the delight part is really, really good. Juan Carlos Williams, Red Wheelbarrow. Beautiful little short poem. What the hell does it mean? There's a red wheelbarrow, there's chickens, there's rainwater. Big deal. That's it. It's designed to delight. There's not any great deep meaning there. So, following Horace, Caedmon and other Anglo-Saxon poets, see poetry as twofold. So, this is what Caedmon does. Notice, this is still relatively early in the history of the English language. The English language is still developing at this point. It's still unifying behind that Anglian dialect. Okay? Well, let's leave Caedmon for a moment and go on to Sutton Hoo. And I'm giving you a bunch of different URLs. So what's so big about Sutton Hoo? I mentioned it the other day. It's a burial site.
Like a shipwreck.
Right. There is a ship discovered. For example, Sutton Hoo on this map is not showing. It's right there. Okay, this is all East Anglia in this area. Okay, Sutton Hoo is right there. If you go to London today and you want to go to Sutton Hoo, it's kind of a pain. You go to Liverpool Street Station, and you take a train in this direction. You don't go directly to Sutton Hoo. You go to Ipswich. And my page just turned. You go to Ipswich, and then you take a bus, and then you walk a mile. Okay? Now, these are various Anglo-Saxon sites. So it's right here. Notice you have a little stream called the Deben River. Okay? Well, Sutton Hoo, as we've said, is an Anglo-Saxon burial site. And there you have an image of what was discovered in 1939. The woman upon whose property, or the woman who owned the property, that had all these mounds. She knew they were burial mounds. These aren't naturally shaped mounds. Okay? So she knew these things are burial mounds. She just wondered, is there anything left in them? So she hired a local archaeologist, Basil something or other. And just before the outbreak of World War II, he digs into the biggest mound. He's thinking he's going to go for the gold ring, so to speak. And he digs down a little ways, and he discovers this mound has already been dug into in the 19th century. So he's thinking, if there was anything here, it's already been plundered. But he keeps going. And this is what he discovers. See all these dark lines here? Those are rust deposits of rivets. Okay? Because the planking on this thing, if you were looking at it from the side, it's built like this. And you got rivets in here. Okay? You can even, this isn't a very good image, you can even see the imprint of what had been the wood planking in some images. Okay? So, he digs down. There was an actual ship buried in this thing. The mound is like 50 feet tall and a little over 100 feet in diameter. That's why I said big mound. Right? Another one of these was just recently discovered last year in Norway. Hasn't been excavated. It was discovered using LIDAR, which is ground penetrating radar. Okay? As far as we know, it's been untouched for 1,000 years. This one that was discovered in Norway. I think they're planning on excavating at some point. Okay, so what's so big about Sutton Hoo? Well, we think that Sutton Hoo was a commemorative burial for, let's go out a little bit, for a Anglo-Saxon chieftain named Radwald that Bede mentions. Why is Radwald important? Radwald converted to Christianity and then he kind of unconverted, or he apostatized. Built a Christian temple, and when he apostatized, he raised next to that Christian temple or shrine a pagan shrine. Okay?
How do you spell Radwald?
R-D-W-A-L-D. Sometimes this is spelled with the ash also. Okay? Well, what you have here is kind of the reconstruction of the remaining parts of a helmet that was discovered there. Okay? So all of the darker part, let's go down to 25. All of the darker part is essentially leather that this has been put upon. So where it looks like gold is gold, is solid gold. Okay? And these are just metal pieces that remain. Now, when this thing was first reconstructed in the early 1950s, mid-1950s, they had the cheek plates, these parts here, and this part that covered the back of the neck, created in such a way that when Queen Elizabeth went to the British Museum, because that's where it was housed. They told her, here, Your Highness, and try it on. And she put it on, and one thing she immediately realized, if you're wearing this thing, you can't raise your arms at all, because what happens when you raise your arms? Your shoulders go up. This blocked the shoulders. So they kind of went, that doesn't work. Because you can't raise your arms at all, you can't raise a sword, you can't raise a shield. Okay? So they went back to the drawing board and reconstructed it. Now let me zoom in on this. This is another one of the pieces that's discovered at Sutton Hoo. This is a purse lid. Okay. What do I mean a purse lid? Well, there had been a leather satchel of some sort. And notice it probably had at the top of it a wooden frame, and it was sewn onto that. So you have a hinge at the top there, and there, and then you have a clasp. Okay? Now, this is not original material, but all of this part, all the red part essentially is. It's called cloisonne. C-L-O-I-S-S-O-N-E. It's cloisonne. It's a kind of metalwork. And inlaid in that cloisonne are pieces of glass. And here you can see, what looked like black and blue checkerboard. The blue there is lapis lazuli. Now, this whole thing is about that big. Okay? So if you look at even how big this looks up here, and shrink it down to this size, this is extremely fine. Okay? In terms of the construction quality. Each, like in here, each of those, that's inlaid within solid gold framing. When is this produced? Radwald died in the early 7th century, the 620s. What is that period of Northern Europe, or even all of Europe, generally called? Early 7th century, the Dark Ages. This is produced during the so-called Dark Ages. Some of the metalwork that's been discovered at Sutton Hoo cannot be reproduced today. Similarly, if I were to put up the Book of Kells or the Lindisfarne Gospels, there are what are called manuscript illuminations. There's a particular page called the carpet page. There's not a calligrapher alive that can reproduce that. The technique, the ability has essentially been lost. Okay? This is the Dark Ages. Why is it called the Dark Ages? Or who calls it the Dark Ages? Okay.
Did it have something to do with the movement to classicism and stuff?
A little bit later, Renaissance scholars call it the Dark Ages. Because what's the Renaissance?
The rebirth.
Rebirth of what? Classical learning. Why is it reborn? Because it died. At the end of the Roman Empire, with the fall of Rome, sacking of Rome in 410, and the Renaissance begins, Italy, 13th century. So everything between there, kind of the Dark Ages. Okay? Let me shrink that back out. Just a couple more images from Sutton Hoo, and then we will go on. I think they're going to be from Sutton Hoo. Maybe not. No. So, I don't think I'm going to do that. Let me turn the lights back up just a bit. So, go back to here. Latin again introduced to the island of Britain. When? When's Latin first introduced? When the Romans come. Okay? Germanic tribes invade. when is Latin first introduced to Germanic speakers? Is it when the Germanic tribes invade Britain? It's through commerce and war on the continent. Okay? That's the first kind of introduction of Latin to what will become English through the Anglian dialects. Okay? It gets reintroduced, or simultaneously, if you want, introduced through the conquering of Britain by Caesar and such. And then it gets introduced again through the Christianization. Okay? Only this time it's being introduced to the actual, what we would call English language. All right? You've got the map in front of you in your notes, so I'm not going to talk about the map of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Let's go on a bit. Whoa, what happened there? Shrink this down. The Viking invasions. Don't confuse the Viking invasions with the Germanic invasions. Germanic invasions occur beginning 449, 450. The Viking invasions occur beginning late 8th century. Okay? Yes, the Vikings are Germanic. Okay? But the Germanic tribes are not the Vikings. So, these begin in the late 8th century. The entry for the year 787 reads, we know it's off, by the way. It's actually the year 789. Reads, Her no Bertrick, King Offen, Dr. Eadberga, and on his dagum, kwam an erst 3 shipu. The Thasareva Therterag, and here wolde driva to Thas Kinningus tuna, Thehinista what here whereon, Hiena mon Ofslon, that were and the Ariston shipu, Danish Ramona, the Anglicanus land Yasota. Translated, in this year, Bertrick took Eadberga, the daughter of Offa, to wife. And in his days came first 3 ships. That is, 3 Viking longships. Okay? And then the reeve rode thereto, sheriff, and he would drive them to the king's town because he knew not what they were, and he was slain. These were the first ships of the Danish men that sought the land of the English nation. One of the entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I don't remember which version this is, probably the Peterborough. There's, I think, 6 different Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. One of them merely reads, for this year, very enigmatically, in this year, 3 longboats were seen. Not landed. They're just seen on the horizon. Okay? So, who are the Vikings? Notice, they're called Danes. They're called actually 2 things. They're called Danes, and they're called heathens. Heathens. Danes and heathens. But they're not just Danes. They're also Norwegians, and there are some Swedish. Not many, though. The Swedish primarily ravaged northern Europe and went off into areas of Russia and such. Okay? So what did the Vikings do? Well, initially, they just plundered. Where would they plunder? Go back to this map for a moment. They come, and they merely hit the coastlines. Okay? That is, they're not making incursions into the interior of the country. And you can barely see it there, but right up here, where that writing is off the edge of the map, that's Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne, Celtic word that means holy isle, holy island. There is a monastery on Lindisfarne that was pretty famous because of who founded it. And that was one of the first places the Vikings hit. Why would you hit a monastery?
Because
Okay, they're not harmed. Why else? I mean, monks take vows of poverty. They take vows of poverty, but they also perform religious services.
They got like the Lindisfarne Gospel, right?
Yeah, but the Vikings wouldn't be interested in that because they couldn't read.
Oh, I see. But it has like
The gold. The gospel book would be covered in gold. It would have a gold binding. The apostle book, the book of epistles, would have a gold covering. The paten, or the discus that was used in the Eucharist service would be made of gold. The chalice would be made of gold. Candlestands would be made of gold. Why? Because they're hoarding all this gold for themselves? No, because it's, to worship the Lord. You want to give the very best to God, so you put it in gold and cover it with gems and such. Well, that's where you want to hit. I mean, if you want stuff that's worth a lot, hit the monasteries. Well, what else did monasteries have other than gold and silver and gems? Food and beer, okay. Hit 7-Eleven while you're at it. Books.
we just established they can't read though.
Yeah, the Vikings couldn't read. So what do you do if you attack someplace and it has things that you don't understand?
You sell them.
You burn them. It's estimated that probably 90% of the literature of medieval England is destroyed because of two things. Okay? Partially the Vikings. Trevor knows where I'm going with the next one. And Henry VIII. The Vikings first. Why? They plunder the monasteries and then they burn them. Okay? They take the gold coverings from the books and then they throw away the books. And then Henry VIII, then we'll talk about Henry VIII later. Other than to say, why does Henry VIII have a beef with books? Is it because he couldn't read? No, Henry VIII was a scholar. Henry VIII was called by the Pope defender of Rome before he became the undefender of Rome.
Yeah.
Because of the books he had written against Martin Luther that we'll talk about later. Okay? So, what do the Vikings do? Well, they start off by plundering. What else do they do? They start by plundering. That is, they hit and run. But after a while, the Vikings realize, as did the Germanic tribes before them, several hundred years before them, they don't have to run. They can hit and stay. Because bear in mind, if you were to look at this map and extrapolate it, let's say to this map, where are the Vikings coming from? Okay, this is Denmark. Where's Norway? Right up here. Sweden's over here. So Norway's here. Denmark's here. Quite a bit farther south latitude-wise. Winters are not nearly as harsh here in England as they are, especially up here in Norway, where, parts of Norway are above the Arctic Circle. Okay? So, what do the Vikings start to do? They stay over for the winter. And then they stay over for the spring. And they decide, summer's not so bad here. And they start staying over year round. And then they start inviting their families over. Right? So they bring their families, they bring their wives and children over, but not all of the Vikings have wives and children. Some of them are 16, 17, 18 years old. And what do? They find wives among the Anglo-Saxons. Okay? Because Old Norse and Old English are relatively close. It's not that hard to strike up a conversation between the two languages, and by pointing at things, be able to communicate. Okay? So, once they start to settle, Old Norse terms start to be borrowed by Anglo-Saxon speakers. And the Vikings learned some Anglo-Saxon, in return. Okay? Now, Old Norse especially takes root in the north of England in the area called the Danelaw. Which this map shows. I'm going to go back in a moment. The Danelaw is essentially, here's London, runs along this line. Everything north of that line. That line, by the way, not exactly, but it pretty much follows an old Roman road called Watling Street. And if you go to London today, go down by St. Paul's Cathedral, you can walk part of the original Watling Street. It's paved over, yes, but it's part of the original Roman road. Okay? So why is this called the Danelaw? We're gonna back up in just a moment to help explain that. It's because of Alfred the Great. Okay? So I'm gonna get my pages all messed up. Back here. So when did the invasions begin? Late 8th century. Alfred becomes king in the late 9th century. I think 871. Got its dates. Top of the next page. Yeah. Alfred becomes king, late 9th century, 871. Let's talk about his name for a minute. Notice you have here, Alfred. Elf, what it means. An elf doesn't simply mean like elf. Don't think, or Will Ferrell. Idiot. Because that would be idiot advice. Alf also means, or can be related to nobly, or princely, or better than those, supernaturally. Because the elves were kind of supernatural creatures. They were different nature than us. Okay? But the rad there, we've talked about that word. You get arrested and what happened? A cop reads you your rights. Read there is used in the Old English native sense. You're advised of your rights. Okay? So, his name means elf or supernaturally advised or counseled. Now, Alfred never should have become king. Why? Youngest of 5 sons. Older brothers, one of whom mentally unable. Okay? Others die, etc. I mean, his mother raises him to essentially be a scholar. In fact, she gave a competition to her boys. The first one of you who can learn to read will get this little book of poetry, Anglo-Saxon native poetry. We wish we knew where this book was, or that it survived. Apparently it doesn't. And Alfred cheated. According to his earliest biographer, a contemporary is a bishop. He cheated. He memorized the poems in the book, so that when his mother pointed to read this, he just recited it. Not because he learned it to read it, he memorized what it looked like. Take a 5-year-old kid and read Goodnight Moon to that child for 2 weeks in a row, and guess what? You turn to a page, and that kid can point to that image and tell you what is on that page. Because he can read it? Nope. He's got it memorized. Alfred did the same thing at about the age of 12 to a book of poetry. He still didn't know how to read. He learns how to read later. He becomes a great scholar. In fact, he translates material from Latin into Old English. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So, He is the only English monarch with the title the Great. Okay? And it's simply because of what he did with the Vikings. Go to Winchester, the town of Winchester, and that's the statue you will see kind of in the town square. One of the big questions in English archaeology is, where is Alfred buried? They used to think they knew. A couple of years ago, they were doing a dig in Winchester because they thought they might have found his bones. I don't think they've ever actually proven that it was. We do have descendants of Alfred still around. Okay? So, he becomes king of Wessex in 871. Wessex in 871 is essentially about here. So take this map and go just this place. Okay? Wessex, West Sax. It's where the West Saxons, or the Saxons in the west part of the country, developed. Viking invasions are still going on. Okay? So Alfred has got to fight the Danes. And famously, in a battle in 878, he defeats the chief of the Viking army, a guy named Guthrum. Okay? Watch Netflix or Amazon? Netflix, I think. Netflix is The Last Kingdom, which is based upon the novels by Bernard Cornwell, about a guy named Uhtred the Dane. He's not actually a Dane, but he gets adopted by the Danes. That are set in the time period of King Alfred. It's a great series of books. The first season of The Last Kingdom's really good. The second season completely lost my interest. But it's about Alfred and his fights against the Danes and such. Okay? So, he defeats Guthrum the Dane in 878 in a famous battle where he was... Yes?
Can you show us where the Danelaw line is again?
Roughly, here's London, roughly following this pattern on this map that is in your notes. Okay? So everything north of that, Danelaw, everything south and or west of that is English. Okay? And we'll be talking about that in just a moment, because that's related to 878. So, in 878, Alfred, who is on his last stand, I mean, he's lost several battles, and he has retreated to the West Country into the marshes of Somerset. He winters there. I mean, he and his men are literally wintering in the swamps. Okay? They know Guthrum and the other Danes are getting ready to attack. And somehow, Alfred and his men, horribly outnumbered, it's like 12 to 1, horribly outnumbered, attack from the swamps, and they defeat this great Viking army. Right? And he makes Guthrum swear a peace treaty. Treaty is called, I don't remember if it's in your notes or not, the Treaty of Wedmore. Right? And the treaty has a variety of stipulations to it. The really key ones are Guthrum has got to become a Christian. And Alfred will be his godfather. Now, don't think Mario Puzo, godfather. Godfather here means Alfred will ensure that Guthrum is trained properly in the faith. That's what the job of a godparent is. To make sure that child is brought up properly, or adult in this case. And according to the historical sources, it appears that Guthrum really does convert. I mean, he really has a, Grinchian type conversion His heart was too small, and it grew 10 times that day, etc. Never marched to war again against the Anglo-Saxons. Okay? Became a Christian, started churches, the whole 9 yards. The other really important part of that is the Danelaw was established. Okay? What does that mean? It means everything north of this boundary becomes the area where Danish law holds sway. That is, they rule. Think of this as Danish kingdom. This is English kingdom. You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. All right? And that buys Alfred about 20 years of peace. So, beginning 878 or so, 879, what does Alfred start to do? He starts instituting reforms in the English kingdom. Okay? Cultural reforms. He starts schools. He starts scriptoria, that is places for manuscripts to be copied and produced. He starts a translation program. And by that I mean he has 5 major books. I don't have them in your notes, do I? No, I do not. Which means I will not remember all 5 of them. He has 5 major books translated from Latin into Old English. One, a Spanish theologian / historian named Orosius, his History of the World, gets translated from Latin into English. Bede, I'm making notes for myself for all these. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English-speaking people gets translated from Latin into Old English. Gregory the Great's Soliloquies gets translated, as does his Pastoral Care, or How to Be a Good Priest, How to Be a Good Shepherd. I knew that would happen. There's a 5th one. I'll bring it on Thursday. Okay. So Alfred has these translated. We think, we're not positive, he also has instituted or begun the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. That is, the history of the kingdoms of the English people. Okay? That's not a translation. That's something he begins. Okay? It's thought, oh, I know what else. Boethius. Consolation of Philosophy. Which, by the way, is the most important book of the Middle Ages. More important than the Bible. It's copied everywhere. Okay? So, he has all of these translated into English. Why? One, he wants his monks and priests, etc., to be able to read in the Old English language. He wants them to be able to read all of these to understand these. Why? These become source materials for homilies and such. This is part of his cultural reform. This, read this and you're a well-educated English person, so to speak. All right? It's thought that Alfred himself takes the position upon himself for translating this, the Pastoral Care. Why? Because we know he writes a preface to it. Usually when students are learning Old English, graduate students are taking a course and they learn Old English, one of the first complete works of prose that they will read is Alfred's preface to the Pastoral Care. Not because it's so great in and of itself in terms of what it says about the Pastoral Care, but because of what it tells us about Anglo-Saxon society at the time the translation is going on. Because Alfred says here that north of the Humber River, okay, which is up, which is up here, this area in north, this is the Humber River. North of the Humber River, there are not any priests who know any Latin. If they don't know Latin, then what does that mean? They don't know what they're doing. Because all the services of the church are done in Latin. Okay? And he says, and barely below the Humber River do any know. So when he says about this cultural reform, he's not only trying to get people to learn English writing letters, but he's also trying to reestablish learning among the clergy and such. Okay? So he has 5 copies of this made. He translates it, 5 copies are made. They're sent to different kind of monastic learning centers. And included with those are, let's see if I can find it real quickly. Alfred says I don't think it's going to be in here. A bookmark of sorts. And in the late 19th century, yeah, there it is. This was discovered. This is what's called the Alfred Jewel. It's at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Gold, cloisonné work, that is glasswork with gold, framing. This, we think, is an image of Alfred. Written along the outside in Anglo-Saxon lettering is Alfred het mich wirtjen. Alfred ordered me to be made. We think this was one of 5. One of these was sent with each of the copies of the pastoral care. Okay? Kind of like, this is Alfred's gift to a bishop. Use this to keep your place, because it probably had a thin piece of silver, like a bookmark would right here. So you stick it in the top of your book and such. Okay? Take that aside. So Alfred goes about this whole process, as we said, of cultural restoration, if you want. Okay? His descendants, his son and grandson, then began to expand the English kingdom. That is, the Danelaw, the mark, the divider line, starts to get pushed farther and farther north. And it's his grandson who actually will unite all of England in a battle. Tolkien rips this off, by the way, of 5 armies. He defeats 4 other armies. Army of the King of Scotland, Army of the King of Ireland, Viking army, and a Danish army. Okay? And becomes king of all Britain, essentially, at that point. All right? But that's not the end of the story. Why? Because that doesn't stop the Vikings. So, England gets reconquered by Denmark. Athelred the Unrad, commonly called Athelred the Unready. Okay? It's not what it means. It's not that he's not prepared. Unread means unwise, ill-advised. Okay? He becomes king in 979. Notice, that's just about 100 years after Alfred was king. Okay? And it's under his reign the Danes renew their attacks. In 1014, he abdicates the throne. He doesn't issue a formal abdication like what was it? Edward VI did in the 1930s. He flees. He flees to France. Why? Because the Danes are invading. Actually, they're Norwegians at this point. Okay? He flees to France. He dies in 1016. Svein Forkbeard, literally, okay, Svein Forkbeard has invaded, and in 1014 kind of becomes king. He dies. His son, Knut, modern English spelling, Canute, becomes king in 1016. When he becomes king, he's now king of England and Norway. Okay? He will have a grandson who will become Saint Olaf, first Christian king of Norway, or sainted king. So, Canute reigns for about 20 years, 19 years. He dies in 1035. His son becomes king. He dies in 1042 without a son. Who becomes king? Ethelred's son. Okay. His son comes back over from France. His name is Edward the Confessor. Now, by the way, I should mention, Ethelred's wife doesn't go to Paris with him. She stays in England. She marries another man, and it's from that union that will come the person who in 1066 gets a conquest of England, William the Conqueror. Okay? So, Edward the Confessor becomes king 1042. Why is he named Edward the Confessor? Because he's so holy, supposedly. Okay, so how do we know he's so holy? Well, he's married, but he doesn't have any children. Okay, a lot of people are married, don't have children. It's thought that he never consummates his marriage. There are other reasons why he might not have consummated his marriage. He might not have liked women. Okay? Just saying, we have no proof. But he dies without an heir on January 4th, 1066. What do you do when your king dies and you don't have an heir? It's not like 600 years later, 540 years later, when Queen Elizabeth dies. She has a cousin waiting in the wings. He does have a little brother, by the way, but he doesn't become king. Okay? The most powerful man in England arranges so that his eldest son, the very next day, is elected king by the Witan, the king's body of counselors, advisors. Think of it, the Witan, as the president's cabinet. Okay? Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man, Godwin. Harold Godwin's son becomes crowned king. And the dominoes start falling. Why? Because between this date and this date, an important little tete-a-tete happened, you know. Trump and Kim Jong-il were meeting this week in Hanoi, Vietnam. Well, in about 1056, Edward the Confessor had a meeting with William of Normandy, which we'll talk about Thursday. And Thursday, we'll start getting into the actual language change. And I am dropping, let me mention this, I'm dropping the requirements to do the Old English Lord's Prayer, Middle English Lord's Prayer, and Early Modern English Lord's Prayer. I'm going to make those extra credit opportunities. Probably 10 points apiece. But I need to put new audio